We now turn to looking at some problems of deontology, and Kant's theory in particular. The first problem is basically the problem of duty, and some critics regard the notion of duty as inadequate as a basis for morality. After all, it makes sense to say that we have a duty to a particular person, or say our country, or to a particular organization. But when it comes to the sort of general duty that Kant talks about, one might be inclined to ask, a duty to do what? And why? What is this duty to? And determining the answer to this why question seems to result in an answer that is somewhat less than satisfying. Now, the deontologists, of course, do attempt to answer this question with their theories. Also, it could be contended that it perhaps, makes an assumption about how morality should work that's unfair to the deontologist. Second problem is a problem of inflexibility, which is a general problem for absolutism, and of course a problem for Kant, because his moral theory is absolutist. That is to say that it allows no exceptions. So the absolutist moral rules, those accepted by Kant, do not allow any exception. So suicide, for example, is always wrong, no matter what. Lying is always wrong, no matter what. And of course, as we saw with Kant, we're not allowed to consider consequences when assessing an action, because the action itself is intrinsically good or bad. The consequences, from the moral standpoint, do not matter. Now, intuitively, our moral intuitions seem to favor allowing exceptions. That is to say, our intuitions often go against absolutism. The usual example is, of course, lying. In general, we see lying as wrong. But we generally intuitively accept many exceptions. For example, lying to save somebody's life could be seen as acceptable based on the consequences. Or when parents lie to their children about things like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. In those cases, we might be inclined to say that it's a lie, but not wrong. Also, as we saw when we talked about utilitarianism, our moral intuitions often favor assessing things based on the consequences. Now, there's a couple of ways that the deontologist can reply. One is that a deontologist could claim that we could construct the rules in a suitable way to allow for the apparent exceptions and to allow for the consequences. That is to say, build up a system of rules that handles everything in accord with these intuitions. Another option is to do what's known as biting the bullet, to simply accept that there are no exceptions and consequences are irrelevant, as counterintuitive as those might be, to simply take that as correct. And of course, back that up with arguments. And of course, one can be a deontologist without being an absolutist. But this is, of course, a problem for Kant. Now, another problem is the problem with rationality, namely this. People who are critical of Kant often note that he divides the world into two extreme categories, those which are rational beings, which have intrinsic worth, and everything else, which has no intrinsic worth whatsoever. Now, not surprisingly, those who think non-rational beings have value see this as a problem. To use a particular example, those who believe that animals should have moral weight, be of moral concern, would see this as a problem. Those who believe that, say, the environment should have a moral status, would see this as a problem. Now, the reply, of course, to this, for someone like Kant, or someone who rejects the notion of non-rational beings having value, is, of course, to make the case that rational beings have value, non-rational beings don't. Now, interestingly, or boringly enough, when we get to the part where we look at species equality, we'll see that Kant, even though he claims that non-rational beings have no intrinsic worth, he does present a view that argues that we should treat animals well, and we'll see this later on. Now, another problem put forth by philosophers is that it would seem that terrible maxims would pass Kant's test. For example, suppose George hates all French people and wants them all dead. And his maxim is, I give myself permission to kill the French. His universal law, everyone has permission to kill the French, would not seem to involve any contradiction. So killing the French would seem to be acceptable. But of course, that seems clearly wrong. Now, a couple of replies possible. One would be that it could be contended that such maxims would involve a defect in a being's rationality. Because the question would be, why would a sane person want to just kill people for no reason? A second would, of course, be that these maxims would violate Kant's other, moral version of the categorical imperative, to treat rational beings as ends, not merely as means. And clearly, simply killing people would treat them as means. A final consideration for Kant are problems raised regarding his notion of a kingdom of ends, that rational beings must be treated as ends. Now, this does help with many cases, such as, things like genocide or robbing people or otherwise harming people to achieve one's goals. Because his notion of the kingdom of ends, that we are rational beings of absolute worth, makes it clear we cannot simply treat people as means. But of course, one point of concern is it doesn't tell us how to resolve many moral conflicts that don't involve just being ends, but involve conflicts with people in terms of settling particular issues. It also raises the question of what does that actually mean in concrete terms to treat beings as ends and not merely treating them as means? What sort of behavior is required? Now, the reply that Kant or Kantian can give is that carefully considering the nature of the kingdom of ends will solve these problems and provide us with the concrete applications, or so they claim. So as usual, for every objection, there is a counter. And next we'll turn to looking at the final part for part 2, namely looking at ethical relativism and subjectivism.